Johan Rudolph Thorbecke was a Dutch politician and statesman of liberal signature, one of the most important Dutch politicians of the 19th century. In 1848 he virtually single-handedly drafted the revision of the Constitution of the Netherlands, giving less power to the king, and more to the States General of the Netherlands. Early life and education. Thorbecke was born in Zwolle. His father Frederick Willem was a Lutheran tobacco manufacturer of German descent, while his mother Christine Regina was born in the Lower Saxon Osnabrück. Frederick Willem's business suffered badly from the anti-British policies of the French occupiers, and his tobacco factory went bankrupt in 1803, after which he was unable to find another source of employment and would spend most of his time on the education of Johan Rudolph and his younger brother. Johan Rudolph proved to be diligent and exemplary at a young age, showing intelligence and curiosity. Because of the sacrifices of his parents, who continued to struggle with financial problems, he was able to enjoy decent education. He enjoyed primary education in his birthplace and in Amsterdam, where he lived until 1806, and attended a Latin school back in Zwolle until 1814. Thorbecke began studying classical literature and philosophy in Amsterdam, studies he finished in Leiden, defending a thesis on Asinius Pollio in 1820. Shortly after his promotion, Thorbecke was granted a state scholarship for a journey through Germany. At Gießen he lectured as an extraordinary professor, and at Göttingen, in 1824, published his treatise Über das Wesen der Geschichte. He would spend 4 years traveling, during which he was introduced to historism and romanticism, and developed emotionally and spiritually. Upon his return to the Netherlands in 1824, he settled in Amsterdam, where he wrote his first political work of significance, Bedenking Omgaand het Recht en den Staat. The work managed to catch attention, and Thorbecke became professor of political science at Ghent University the following year, a position he was forced to resign from due to the Belgian Revolution in 1830. The following year, Thorbecke became professor of diplomacy and modern history at the Leiden University, where his students would describe him as a distant, analytical mind, living a secluded life in his study. Originally a loyal supporter of the conservative government of William I, Thorbecke developed a more critical view of the government and indeed the autocratic system of government throughout the 1830s. His increasingly strong support for constitutional reform is shown in a series of essays he published from 1839 onward, starting with Aantekening op de Grondwet, literally annotation on the Constitution. The climax of this series was over het Gedurmd Eigsburgerschap, literally on contemporary citizenship, published in 1844, in which he argued that universal suffrage would eventually be unavoidable. Political career. On the 21st of May 1844, Thorbecke was elected into the House of Representatives for South Holland. In the House, he developed into the leader of the liberal opposition and, later that year, joined forces with 8 like-minded members in a vain attempt to amend the constitution in the so-called Voorstel der Negen Mannen. 4 years later, with much of Europe convulsed by the revolutions of 1848, William II agreed upon the formation of a committee for revision of the constitution. Thorbecke was appointed as head of this committee on the 17th of March. The changes were virtually all created by Thorbecke, as the other members of the committee did little but approve of his proposals. The drafted constitution was somewhat reluctantly approved by the States General, and was proclaimed on the 3rd of November 1848. The new constitution established civil rights and parliamentary competences, and introduced direct election of members of House of Representatives and ministerial responsibility over governance, thus limiting the power of the king and turning the country into a complete constitutional monarchy. Despite initial reluctance, William II appointed Thorbecke as formator in late October 1849, and his first cabinet took office on 13 November. In this cabinet, Thorbecke served as Minister of the Interior and chaired the Council of Ministers, thus becoming de facto Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Thorbecke's first cabinet passed several acts of particular importance, including the Electoral Act and the Province Act in 1850, and the Municipality Act in the following year. Despite these successes, Thorbecke's reforms were increasingly subjected to resistance, and he was criticized for his haughtiness and his strained relationship with the king. In 1853, the Catholic Church sought to restore the episcopal hierarchy in the Netherlands. Common people, pastors and conservative notables showed resistance to this in an anti-papal movement known as the Aprilbeweging. Thorbecke, who remained passive in the issue in defense of the separation of church and state, was accused of Catholic sympathies, and he was forced to resign. Thorbecke spent 9 years as leader of the opposition in the House of Representatives. He pleaded for neutrality in the Crimean War 1854, and opposed the religious nature of the Primary Education Act in 1857. The collapse of the Conservative cabinet in 1862 brought Thorbecke back in power. On 31 January 1862, he started his second term as Minister of the Interior and Chairman of the Council of Ministers. Thorbecke's relationship with the king had improved because the focus of his reforms had shifted from politics to economics. And despite the increased disunity among the liberals, his cabinet lasted for 4 years because of the support of the Catholics. One of Thorbecke's first acts in his second term was the abolition of the governmental departments for religious services. Other notable achievements include the construction of several canals, the Secondary Education Act in May 1863, several acts on health care, and the municipal tax reform in 1865. The cabinet collapsed on 10 February 1866 and Thorbecke resigned after a conflict regarding criminal law in the Dutch East Indies. Thorbecke returned to being leader of the opposition in the House of Representatives. In 1868, he formed the Van Bossevok cabinet, but did not take part in the cabinet himself. 3 years later, after this cabinet had collapsed over foreign policy, the 73-year-old Thorbecke did not hesitate to start his third term. In December 1871 fell ill, and never fully recovered. Thorbecke died at his home in The Hague on 4 June 1872, at the age of 74. Hated by some, he is nowadays considered a towering figure in Dutch parliamentary history. There are 2 statues of Thorbecke, and a room in the Dutch Parliament building is named after him. Thorbecke wrote many articles on history and several newspaper articles on topics of the day. He published a study on the philosophy of history. All of his speeches in Parliament have been published.